All right, today we're going to talk about a tool that, let's be honest, is pretty much everywhere in modern project management, JIRA. If you've ever heard people talking about it but weren't totally sure what it's all about, well, you've come to the right place. We're going to slice through all the jargon and get right to its simple, powerful core.
So, to really get why JIRA is such a big deal, let's start with the scene that's probably pretty familiar. Let's talk about the exact problem it was designed to solve.
You know the same, right? The wall absolutely covered in colorful sticky notes. I mean, it's visual, you can touch it, and for a small team all sitting in the same room, hey, it can actually work pretty well. But what happens when things start to get just a little more complex?
Yeah, this is where that whole analog system just completely shatters. I mean, think about it. Suddenly your team is spread out across the globe. Stakeholders are constantly asking what's the status. You're trying to track hundreds of moving parts. You can't get forecasting data from a trash can full of old sticky notes, right? And you definitely can't prove who did what for an audit. That beautiful board just becomes a source of total chaos. Even if you move to a spreadsheet, you still don't get the structure or the history you desperately need.
So how do you bring order back from that chaos? Well, this is exactly where JIRA comes in. And it's not just a piece of software. It's really a central hub for your entire agile way of working.
At its heart, JIRA is basically that digital whiteboard we were just talking about. But it's a whiteboard with a perfect memory and a rule book. It's built from the ground up to support the way modern teams really work, in fast, iterative cycles with tons of collaboration and at a scale that physical tools just can't even dream of handling.
And that really gets us to its core value. First, it's a single source of truth. No more asking, hey, is this the latest version of the spreadsheet? Nope, all the work lives here. It also gives you incredible transparency, so anyone can see what's going on at any time. It's also super flexible, so it doesn't matter if your team uses Scrum with its short sprints or Kanban with a more continuous flow. And maybe most importantly, it gives you traceability. Every single action is tracked, creating this permanent, searchable history of your project.
Now, it's interesting to see where JIRA fits into the whole ecosystem of tools. You've got something like Trello, which is fantastic for small teams and simple projects. But JIRA is built for way more complexity and scale. Then you have Microsoft Project, which is really designed for those old-school, rigid waterfall plans. JIRA, on the other hand, is all about the flexibility of Agile. And while tools like Asana are awesome for general project management, JIRA's real secret sauce is how deeply it plugs into the world of software development.
Okay, so to really get your head around JIRA, you've got to learn to speak the language. So let's break down the 4 absolute fundamental concepts that everything else is built on top of.
First up, the project. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's the main container, kind of like a digital folder, for a whole big initiative. Everything for your new mobile app or your Q4 marketing campaign is going to live inside its own project. Simple enough?
Okay, now inside a project you have issues, and this is a really key JIRA term you got to know. In the world of JIRA, everything is an issue. Found a bug? That's an issue. A new feature idea? That's an issue. A simple little to-do item? You guessed it, that's an issue too. It's the basic building block of all work.
Next up is the workflow. This is just the journey that an issue takes from beginning to end. The classic example is, to do, in progress, and done. But the real power here is that you can customize this to perfectly mirror how your team actually works. It makes your process visible to everybody.
And finally, we have the board. This is where it all comes together visually. The board is your interface, your digital command center. It shows all your issues as little cards, and the columns on the board represent the different stages of your workflow. This is where your team's going to live day in and day out.
JIRA also gives you this fantastic way to structure your work so you don't get overwhelmed. You start with an epic. That's a huge body of work, like building a whole user authentication system. Then you break that down into smaller stories, which are manageable pieces of work that deliver value to a user. And then each story can be broken down even further into tiny, concrete subtasks. This turns what feels like a giant mountain of work into a clear path of small, achievable steps.
Okay, so that's all the theory. But what does this actually look like in the real world? How does this come together? Let's take a look by jumping into the shoes of 2 very different roles and see how they use JIRA every single day.
First, let's imagine we're a developer on a Scrum team. That's an agile approach where you work in these short, focused cycles. How is JIRA going to shape their day?
It's actually beautifully simple. In the morning, they'll grab a story from the to-do column and just drag it over to in progress. Boom! Instantly, the whole team knows what they're working on. As they write their code, they can link it right back to the JIRA issue.
There's that traceability we talked about. When they're done, they move the card to In Review, and finally, to Done. The board always shows the absolute truth of what's happening, with almost zero extra effort.
Okay, now let's switch hats. Let's zoom out from the daily grind and think like a product manager. How are they using the exact same system but for a totally different reason? Long-term strategic planning. Well, the product manager is living at a higher altitude. They're the ones creating those big picture epics and then breaking them down into stories for the team to work on. But here is the magic trick. They use all that historical data that JIRA has been quietly collecting, things like the team's velocity, which is just a measure of how much work they get done, to make data-driven forecasts. They're not guessing when something might be done. They are using real data to plan.
So we've covered the what and the why of JIRA, but now let's talk about the how. Because let's be real, starting with a tool this powerful can feel a little intimidating. And there is one piece of advice from our source material that is absolutely critical.
This is it. This is the whole key. Don't try to boil the ocean and build the world's most perfect, complex system on day one. Just start with the basics. A simple workflow, the default settings, and then let your process evolve as your team figures out what it actually needs. Because the number one mistake, the biggest trap that teams fall into, is this right here. They get all excited and they build these incredibly complicated workflows with, dozens of steps and custom fields before they've even tracked a single task. And it almost always backfires, creating confusion and actually slowing the team down.
And the payoff for keeping it simple at the start? It can be massive. There's a case study that highlights a startup that moved to JIRA. By taking this simple, phased approach, they improved their project timeline accuracy from just 40% to an incredible 85%. I mean, think about that. That's the power of having real clarity and real data.
So as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this one question to think about. Look at your own team's process, the daily frustrations, the questions that get asked over and over again. What is the one bottleneck, the one point of chaos that having a single, clear source of truth like JIRA could finally solve for you?